The great hall was quiet except for the soft hum of the air system. Veltar stood in the center of the room, his dark green scales catching the light from above. Around him sat 12 officers from different worlds. They all looked young to him, even though some had lived for over 100 years. The Galactic Defense Coalition had called this meeting to decide something important. Should they let humans join their elite fighting forces? The question had been debated for weeks across the galaxy. Commander Nexara, a tall blue-skinned officer from the Centauri system, spoke first. Her voice was sharp and clear. The humans have only been traveling in space for 200 years. Most of our species have been doing this for thousands of years. Why should we trust them with our most important missions? Officer Kreloth nodded his large head. His people came from a world with heavy gravity, making them much stronger than most others. I have read their files. They fight each other constantly. Even now they still have wars on their home planet. How can we trust beings who cannot make peace with their own kind? Their technology is basic, added Lieutenant Vashati, her silver skin shimmering as she moved. Their ships are slow. Their weapons are simple. They would only slow us down in real combat. Veltar listened to all of this without speaking. He had served in the Coalition military for over 300 years. He had fought in more battles than any other officer in the room. His body carried scars from a dozen different worlds. His right arm was mechanical now, replacing the one he lost fighting the Hive warriors near the edge of the galaxy. The young officers continued their debate. They talked about human weaknesses. They mentioned their short lives and their emotional nature. They questioned whether humans could follow orders from alien commanders. I think we should give them a chance, said Captain Morden, the youngest officer present. Every species deserves the opportunity to prove themselves. This is not about being fair, Nexara replied coldly. This is about military effectiveness. We cannot risk our missions on sentiment. The debate went on for another hour. Charts and data filled the air above the table, showing human military records and test results. The numbers told a mixed story. Humans were not the strongest or the fastest. Their technology was not the most advanced. But there were other numbers that made some officers pause. Human forces had a strange habit of winning battles they should have lost. They completed missions that seemed impossible. When fighting alongside coalition forces in small operations, human units often performed better than expected. But the young officers focused on the obvious weaknesses. They saw only what the data showed on the surface. Finally, General Thakmore called for quiet. The old commander was ancient even by coalition standards. His species lived for over 1,000 years, and he had served in the military for most of his life. We have heard many opinions today, Thakmore said in his deep voice, but we have not heard from our most experienced combat officer. His eyes turned to Veltar. Commander, you have remained silent throughout this discussion. You have fought alongside humans in several operations. What is your assessment? All eyes in the room focused on Veltar. He had known this moment would come. For weeks he had dreaded having to speak about this topic. The memories it brought back were painful in ways the other officers could not understand. Veltar was silent for a long moment. He looked at each of the young faces around him. They were all competent officers. They had all proven themselves in battle. But they had never experienced what he had experienced. They had never seen what he had seen. You want to know about human warfare? Veltar said finally. His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the hall. You want my assessment of their military capabilities? Yes, Nexara said. Your opinion carries great weight in this decision. Veltar closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, something had changed in his expression. The other officers could see pain there, but also something else. Something that looked almost like fear. Very well, Veltar said. But understand something before I begin. What I am about to tell you will change how you see everything. It will change how you think about war itself. It will change how you think about what it means to be a warrior. The room became even quieter. Even the air system seemed to make less noise. I have fought beside humans, Veltar continued. I have studied their history. I have learned their ways of war. And I tell you now that everything you think you know about military science is wrong. Kreloth shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Commander, surely you are not suggesting that humans are superior fighters to species with thousands more years of experience. I am not suggesting anything, Veltar replied. I am telling you facts. But these are facts that you will find difficult to accept. They are facts that I found difficult to accept. Veltar began to pace slowly around the center of the room. His mechanical arm moved differently than his natural one, but both carried the same tension. 50 years ago, I was part of a coalition expeditionary force. We made first contact with Earth during what the humans called their Third World War. It was a global conflict involving every nation on their planet. The officers listened carefully. First contact stories were always interesting, but there was something in Veltar's voice that made this feel different. I expected to find a primitive species destroying itself through ignorance and aggression, Veltar said. That is what our briefings told us to expect. That is what our xenological studies predicted. He stopped pacing and looked directly at the officers. I was wrong. We were all wrong. And the cost of that mistake nearly destroyed my understanding of what it means to be a soldier. General Thakmor leaned forward in his chair. Even he had never heard Veltar speak this way before. What did you find, Commander? Thakmor asked gently. Veltar's scales seemed to darken slightly. It was a sign of deep emotion among his people. I found something that should not exist, he said. I found warriors who fight not because they love war, but because they love something more than they fear death. I found soldiers who carry the weight of every enemy they kill. I found beings who have learned to weaponize love itself. The silence in the room was complete now. If you truly want to understand human military capabilities, Veltar said, then I will tell you. But I warn you again. Once you hear this story, you will never think about war the same way. You will never think about courage the same way. And you will never think about humanity the same way. He looked around the room one more time. Are you certain you want to know? Veltar's voice became distant as he began to remember. The other officers could see him traveling back in time through his memories. The year was 2387 by human counting. Our expeditionary force arrived at Earth during their global war. The planet was divided between two major powers. The Eastern Federation controlled most of Asia, including Korea, China, and Japan. The Western Alliance controlled Europe and the Americas. Veltar moved to the large window that looked out over the coalition capital city. Ships from 100 different worlds moved through the sky like bright insects. We chose to make contact with both sides at the same time. This was standard procedure. We wanted to avoid taking sides in their conflict. Our mission was simple. Learn about human military capabilities. Determine if they posed any threat to coalition space. Commander Nexara interrupted. You said this was during their World War. Surely they were too busy fighting each other to be a threat to anyone else. That is what we thought, Veltar replied. We were wrong about that too. He turned back to face the room. The Eastern Federation assigned a liaison officer to work with our team. His name was Captain Dongwoo. He was from the Korean Space Defense Force at that time. Humans had only just begun to send ships beyond their own solar system. Veltar paused, his expression softening slightly. Dongwoo was young by human standards, only 35 years old. He had volunteered for an experimental program that would let him interface with alien technology. The process was dangerous. Several humans had died during the early tests. Why would he volunteer for something so risky? Asked Lieutenant Vashidi. That was my first question too, Veltar said. His answer was simple. His country needed every advantage it could get. His people were fighting for their freedom. He was willing to risk his life to help them. Veltar began pacing again, his mechanical arm making soft clicking sounds as it moved. I was assigned to train Dongwoo in coalition combat techniques. My orders were to teach him enough to be useful, but not enough to be dangerous. The High Command was concerned about giving humans too much military knowledge. The alien commander stopped and looked directly at the young officers. On the first day of training, I decided to test him. I put him in a combat simulation against our standard enemy types. These were scenarios that our own cadets train on for months before they can pass. What happened? Captain Mordon asked. Dongwoo failed completely, Veltar said. He could not operate our weapon systems. He could not understand our tactical displays. He made mistakes that would have gotten an entire unit killed in real combat. Some of the officers nodded. This was what they expected to hear about human capabilities. So I decided to try a different approach, Veltar continued. I gave him a human weapon, an old rifle from his own military. I set up a scenario using human tactical doctrine instead of coalition methods. Veltar's expression changed again. The pain in his eyes became mixed with something else. Respect, perhaps, or maybe fear. He did not just pass the simulation, he revolutionized it. Dongwu used tactics that none of us had ever seen before. He turned our own training scenarios against us. He found weaknesses in our combat doctrine that we did not even know existed. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air system. How is that possible? Nexura asked. Our combat doctrine has been developed over thousands of years. That is exactly what I asked him, Veltar replied. His answer was something I will never forget. He said that humans have been fighting wars for their entire history. Every generation learns from the mistakes of the last. Every conflict teaches them something new about combat. Veltar moved to stand behind his chair, gripping it with both hands. But that was not the strangest part. After the simulation ended, Dongwu did something that confused me completely. He asked about the enemy casualties in the scenario. I told him it was just a training program. The enemies were not real, but he still wanted to know how many had died. Why would he care about simulated casualties? Officer Kreloth asked. I asked him the same question, Veltar said. His answer was that every enemy soldier in the simulation represented a real person somewhere. Someone with a family, someone who was fighting for their own reasons. He said that even in practice, a good soldier remembers that killing is never just about numbers. The alien officers exchanged glances. Most species did think of warfare in terms of numbers and tactical advantages. The idea of caring about enemy casualties seemed strange to them. Over the following weeks, I continued to train with Dongwu. Veltar said, I learned more about human military thinking. Their approach to warfare was unlike anything in coalition doctrine. Veltar released his grip on the chair and began pacing again. Humans do not just train to win battles. They train to win wars. But they also train to win the peace that comes after. They think about what happens to civilian populations. They think about how to rebuild after conflict ends. They think about how to prevent the next war from starting. That sounds inefficient, Vashati commented. Warriors should focus on winning battles. I thought the same thing, Veltar admitted. So I decided to test this theory. I created a complex scenario involving multiple enemy types, civilian populations, and unclear objectives. It was the kind of situation that usually takes our best commanders hours to resolve. He stopped pacing and looked at each officer in turn. Dongwu solved it in minutes. Not only did he defeat the enemy forces, but he also minimized civilian casualties and created conditions for long-term peace in the region. His solution was so elegant that we added it to our own training programs. General Thakmor leaned forward with interest. What made his approach so effective? He thought like a human, Veltar said simply. He assumed that every person in the scenario, enemy or ally, had reasons for their actions. He found ways to address those reasons. Instead of just eliminating the threats, Veltar's voice began to shake slightly as he continued. But the most disturbing thing was how he treated prisoners during training exercises. Even when the scenario called for interrogation of captured enemies, Dongwu insisted on following human conventions about prisoner treatment. Did this make the interrogations less effective? Nexera asked. No, Veltar said quietly. It made them more effective. The simulated prisoners gave him more information because they trusted him. They could see that he respected them as individuals, even though they were enemies. The commander walked back to the window and stared out at the city. That was when I began to realize that everything I knew about warfare was incomplete. Humans had developed something that we had never considered. They had learned to fight with honor. Not just personal honor, but honor toward their enemies, honor toward civilians, honor toward the idea that war should make the universe better, not just eliminate threats. Veltar turned back to the room, and the officers could see that his hands were trembling slightly. I began to study human military history. I thought that understanding their past would help me understand their present capabilities. I requested access to their historical databases. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. That was my second mistake. The first was underestimating them. The second was learning too much about who they really are. The silence in the room stretched on for a long moment. What did you find in their history, Commander? General Thakmor asked gently. Veltar closed his eyes. I found something that should have destroyed them as a species long ago, something that should have made them extinct before they ever reached the stars. When he opened his eyes again, there were tears forming at the corners. I found 10,000 years of continuous warfare. Veltar walked away from the window and sat down heavily in his chair. The other officers could see that remembering these events was causing him pain. Dr. He-jin was the human historian assigned to help me understand their military records, he began. She was a professor at Seoul National University before the war started. When I met her, she was working with the Korean military to preserve historical documents. The alien commander's voice became very quiet. Hye-jin was kind to me. She treated me like a friend, not just an alien observer. She offered to show me the full scope of human military history. She warned me that it might be difficult to understand. She was right, but not in the way I expected. Veltar looked down at his mechanical arm, flexing the artificial fingers slowly. The first thing Hye-jin showed me was a timeline, a simple chart showing major human conflicts throughout their recorded history. I expected to see occasional wars like most species have. Territorial disputes every few generations. Resource conflicts during times of scarcity. He looked up at the young officers. What I saw instead was a continuous line of warfare stretching back thousands of years. There was never a time when humans were not fighting somewhere. Not a single generation that grew up without war. Commander Nexara frowned. That seems impossible. No species could survive constant warfare for that long. That is what I thought too, Veltar replied. So I asked Hye-jin to explain. She told me that humans had never achieved global peace. Even during the quietest periods, there were always conflicts happening somewhere on their planet. Veltar began counting on his fingers. In just the past 100 years before we arrived, humans had fought 2 massive global wars, conflicts that killed millions of people. They had developed weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds. They had created poison gases that could kill thousands at once. They had built machines designed only to kill other humans more efficiently. The room was completely silent now. But that was not the worst part, Veltar continued. The worst part was the scale. Hye-jin showed me casualty numbers from their conflicts. In one battle during their First World War, over 1 million soldiers died in just 4 months. One battle, 4 months, 1 million dead. Officer Kreloth shifted uncomfortably. Those numbers seem exaggerated. I thought so too, Veltar said. So Hye-jin showed me the records. Official military documents, burial sites, memorial walls with hundreds of thousands of names carved into stone. The numbers were real. Veltar's voice became strained. Their Second World War was even worse. 50 million dead. Entire cities burned to ash. Civilians targeted deliberately. Children killed for being born to the wrong parents. Industrial facilities built specifically to murder people by the thousands. Lieutenant Vashati looked sick. How could any species do such things to itself? I asked Hye-jin the same question, Veltar replied. Her answer was that humans had learned to hate very effectively, but they had also learned to love very effectively. The same emotional intensity that drove them to terrible violence also drove them to incredible sacrifice. Veltar stood up and began pacing again. She showed me individual stories from their wars. These were the records that broke my understanding of what warfare means. He stopped and looked directly at Captain Morden. There was a young Korean soldier named Taemin during their war with the North. His unit was surrounded by enemy forces. A grenade landed in their position. Taemin could have run to safety. Instead, he threw himself on top of the grenade to save his squad mates. Morden's eyes widened. He sacrificed himself for others? Yes, Veltar said simply. But that was not unusual. Hye-jin showed me thousands of similar stories. Humans who died saving others. Soldiers who refused to abandon wounded comrades. Civilians who hid refugees at the cost of their own lives. Veltar's mechanical arm began making soft clicking sounds as his emotional state affected its systems. There was a medic named So Young who treated enemy soldiers during a battle. She was shot 3 times while providing medical care to people who had been trying to kill her minutes before. When asked why she did it, she said that wounded people were no longer enemies. They were just people who needed help. The alien officers were struggling to understand what they were hearing, but the most disturbing story was about a civilian named Bong-su, Veltar continued. He was just a shopkeeper in Seoul. When refugees began fleeing from the northern territories, Bong-su started hiding families in his store. He gave them food from his own supplies. He risked execution by the authorities. Veltar's voice cracked slightly. Bong-su was eventually caught by security forces. They tortured him to find out where other refugees were hiding. He died without revealing a single location. 73 people lived because one shopkeeper chose to protect strangers instead of saving himself. General Thakmor spoke very gently. Commander, these stories are tragic, but what do they tell us about human military capabilities? Veltar turned to face the general. They tell us that humans do not fight because they enjoy violence. They fight because they love something more than they fear death. Their soldiers do not kill because they hate their enemies. They kill because they love their families, their friends, their ideas about what the universe should be. The commander sat down again, his body showing the weight of memory. I began to understand that human warfare is not about conquest or resources or territory. It is about protecting what they care about. And humans care about things with an intensity that other species do not. Understand? Veltar looked around the room at each. Officer Heejin explained that human soldiers carry something called moral injury. This is emotional damage that comes from participating in violence, even when that violence is necessary. Every human warrior suffers from this to some degree. That sounds like a weakness, Nexara commented. I thought so too, Veltar admitted, until Heejin explained what it really means. Moral injury happens because humans never stop feeling empathy for their enemies. They never stop recognizing that the people they fight are also people with families and dreams and fears. Veltar's voice became very quiet. Most species learn to see enemies as less than people. This makes killing easier. Humans cannot do this. They see enemies as people and kill them anyway when they must. Then they carry the weight of those deaths for the rest of their lives. The mechanical arm clicked more rapidly as Veltar's emotion increased. I asked Hyojin how humans could function as soldiers while carrying this emotional burden. She told me that the burden is exactly what makes them effective. Because they understand the cost of violence, they use it more carefully. Because they feel pain for their enemies, they fight harder to end conflicts quickly. Veltar stood up abruptly. She said something that I will never forget. She said that the best human warriors are the ones who hate war the most, because they understand what it costs everyone involved. The room was completely silent for a long moment. I realized that everything I thought I knew about military science was incomplete. Veltar said, other species train soldiers to be killing machines. Humans train soldiers to be protectors who are willing to kill when necessary. The difference changes everything. Veltar walked back to the window, but I still did not understand the full scope of what this meant. That understanding came later during actual combat, when I saw what human warriors could do when the people they loved were in danger. His reflection in the window showed a being who had been fundamentally changed by his experiences. That is when I learned to fear them. Veltar stood in the center of the room, his entire body trembling. The other officers could see that he was approaching something in his memories that caused him great pain. Everything I had learned about humans was just theory until the Battle of Europa Station, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That was when I saw what human warriors could do when the people they loved were truly in danger. The alien commander walked to the wall and pressed his forehead against the cool metal surface. Europa Station was a coalition research facility orbiting Jupiter's moon. It housed 3,000 scientists and their families from 12 different species. The work being done there was crucial to our understanding of interdimensional physics. Veltar turned back to face the room, his scales darker than before. The station came under attack by a species we had never encountered before. We called them the Devourers. They consumed organic matter to fuel their technology. They had already destroyed 6 colonies in the Outer Rim. Lieutenant Vashati shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I remember reading about those attacks in the military archives. Then you know how brutal they were, Veltar replied. The Devourers did not just kill their victims. They harvested them while still alive. They fed entire populations into their bioprocessors to power their war machines. The room was completely silent. Coalition forces responded to Europa Station's distress call immediately. Veltar continued, I was part of the first wave. We arrived to find the station under siege by a massive Devourer fleet. They had already broken through the outer defenses. Veltar began pacing, his movements showing increasing agitation. The situation was hopeless. The Devourers outnumbered us 10-1. Their ships were heavily armed and shielded. Our tactical computers estimated a less than 5% chance of successful defense. Commander Nexara frowned. How did coalition forces expect to win against such odds? We did not expect to win, Veltar said simply. Our mission was to evacuate as many civilians as possible before the station fell. We had perhaps 6 hours. Before the Devourers broke through the main shields, the alien commander stopped pacing and gripped the back of his chair again. That was when Admiral Kyung-ho arrived. With the human reinforcement fleet, Veltar's voice became strained as he spoke the name. Kyung-ho was a veteran of the Korean War of Reunification. He had commanded human forces during some of their bloodiest battles. His ship was an old Earth cruiser that had been retrofitted with Coalition technology. How many ships did he bring? Officer Kreloth asked. 12, Veltar replied. 12 human ships against a fleet of over 200 Devourer vessels. The officers exchanged glances. The odds seemed impossible. Admiral Kyung-ho contacted our fleet commander immediately upon arrival, Veltar continued. I was on the bridge when the communication came through. I will never forget what he said. Veltar closed his eyes. Remembering, he said, Coalition Command, this is Admiral Kyung-ho of the Human Defense Fleet. We are here to evacuate the civilians and destroy the enemy. In that order. Please coordinate your forces with ours. How could 12 ships evacuate 3,000 people while fighting off 200 enemy vessels? Captain Morden asked. That was exactly what our fleet commander asked, Veltar replied. Kyung-ho's response was simple. He said, Admiral, you are thinking like a soldier. Today we need to think like humans. Veltar opened his eyes, and the officers could see tears forming. What followed was the most extraordinary display of tactical genius and personal sacrifice I have ever witnessed. The alien commander began pacing again, his movements becoming more agitated. Kyung-ho divided his small fleet into 3 groups. The first group engaged the Devourer ships directly, drawing their attention away from the station. The second group began evacuating civilians using human transport ships that could carry twice their rated capacity. And the third group? General Thakmor asked. The third group was just Admiral Kyung-ho and his flagship, Veltar said. He flew directly into the center of the Devourer formation. The room was completely quiet except for Veltar's footsteps. I thought he was committing suicide, Veltar continued. 1 ship against 200 seemed like madness, but Kyung-ho was not trying to win a conventional battle. He was creating chaos. Veltar stopped pacing and faced the officers. Human military doctrine includes something called disruptive tactics. Instead of fighting the enemy's strengths, humans attack their assumptions. They do things that make no tactical sense, which forces the enemy to respond to unexpected situations. How does that work in practice? Nexara asked. Kyung-ho's ship began broadcasting on every frequency, Veltar explained. He was transmitting detailed information about Devourer ship designs, tactical formations, and weapon capabilities. Information that our intelligence services had been trying to gather for months. Lieutenant Vashati looked confused. How did he have access to that information? He did not, Veltar said. He was making it up. But the transmissions were so detailed and confident that the Devourers assumed he had somehow obtained their classified data. They began changing their formations and tactics to counter intelligence they thought he possessed. The alien commander's mechanical arm began clicking rapidly, while the Devourers were reorganizing their fleet. Human evacuation ships were loading civilians as fast as possible. I was assigned to one of the evacuation teams. I saw how humans worked under pressure. Veltar sat down heavily in his chair. The human crew of our evacuation ship was led by Captain Dongwoo, the same officer I had trained with years before. When I saw him again, he looked older. The war had aged him, but his tactical brilliance had only grown. The commander's voice became softer. Dongwoo's ship could officially carry 200 passengers. During the evacuation, he loaded over 400 people onto it. Men, women, children from a dozen different species. He packed them into cargo holds, engineering spaces, even his own quarters. That seems dangerous, Kreloth observed. It was, Veltar agreed. But Dongwoo knew that leaving anyone behind meant certain death, so he took risks with ship safety to save as many lives as possible. Veltar looked down at his hands. I was helping to load civilians when a family of Centaurian refugees was brought aboard. The parents had been injured in the initial attack. Their children were crying and scared. Dongwoo left the bridge to personally help settle them in. The alien commander's voice began to break. I watched this human captain, who was commanding a ship in the middle of a desperate battle, take time to comfort alien children. He knelt down to their level. He spoke to them in their own language. He promised them that they would be safe. Veltar wiped his eyes with his natural hand. That is when I realized that human warfare is not just about tactics or courage. It is about love. Dongwu was not fighting to win a battle. He was fighting to protect innocence. Every decision he made was based on that simple principle. The room was completely silent except for the sound of Veltar's emotional breathing. The evacuation took 4 hours, he continued. During that time, Admiral Kyung-ho's small fleet held off the entire Devourer force. They lost 8 ships in the process. Nearly 3,000 human sailors died buying time for the evacuation. Veltar stood up abruptly, his chair falling backward. But they saved everyone. All 3,000 civilians escaped safely. The research data was preserved. Europa Station was destroyed, but its people survived. The alien commander walked to the window, his reflection showing a being who had been fundamentally changed. I was on the last evacuation ship to leave the station, he said. As we pulled away, I saw Admiral Kyung-ho's flagship make its final attack run. He rammed his ship directly into the largest Devourer vessel. Veltar pressed his hand against the window. The explosion took out 12 enemy ships and crippled their command structure. It gave our fleet the opening we needed to escape. Kyung-ho died in that explosion along with his entire crew. The commander turned back to face the room, tears streaming down his scales. But that was not the end. As our ship fled toward Coalition space, we received a transmission from Captain Dongwu. His ship had taken heavy damage during the evacuation. His engines were failing. He would not be able to keep up with the convoy. Veltar's voice became almost inaudible. Dongwu ordered the other ships to continue without him. He said his crew would buy them time to escape. I was on the bridge when he made his final transmission. The alien commander closed his eyes. He asked me to deliver a message to his daughter Yunseo back on Earth. He wanted her to know that he loved her, that everything he had done was to make the universe safer for her generation. Veltar opened his eyes, and the officers could see that he was completely broken. I held Dongwu as he died. His ship's life support was failing. Enemy fire had breached the hull in multiple places. But his last words were not about the pain or the fear. His last words were about hope. The room was filled with the sound of Veltar's grief. He said that humans would never stop fighting for what was right, that even if his generation failed, the next generation would continue the struggle, that love was stronger than fear and hope was stronger than despair. Veltar collapsed back into his chair. That is when I understood the true meaning of human warfare. They do not fight because they are warlike. Veltar returned to his chair, but he did not sit down. Instead, he gripped the back of it with both hands, his knuckles showing white through his dark green scales. After learning about human history, I thought I understood them, he said. I was wrong again. Understanding their past was only the beginning. To truly comprehend human warriors, I had to understand their hearts. The alien commander looked at each of the young officers in turn. This understanding came through my friendship with Lieutenant Jin-ho. He was assigned to work with our unit as a tactical advisor. Jin-ho had been a soldier in the North Korean army before the war began. When the fighting started, he defected to the south. Veltar's mechanical arm stopped clicking as he concentrated on controlling his emotions. Jin-ho was one of the most effective fighters I had ever encountered. He could move through enemy territory like a ghost. He could eliminate targets with surgical precision. He spoke 6 languages and understood the tactical doctrines of every major human military force. He sounds like an ideal soldier, Captain Morden observed. He was, Veltar agreed, but he was also the most broken person I had ever met. The commander released his grip on the chair and began pacing slowly. Jin-ho suffered from severe nightmares. Every night he would wake up screaming. Sometimes he would speak to people who were not there. Sometimes he would apologize to empty air for things that had happened years before. Veltar stopped pacing and faced the room. I did not understand this at first. In my species, warriors who survive combat become stronger. The experience hardens them against future trauma. But Jin-ho seemed to become more fragile as time passed, not stronger. Lieutenant Vashati looked confused. How could an effective soldier become more fragile? That is exactly what I asked Dr. Min Kyung, Veltar replied. She was a human psychologist working with war veterans. The coalition had assigned me to study human mental health protocols as part of my cultural exchange duties. Veltar sat down finally, but his posture remained tense. Dr. Min Kyung explained that Jinho was suffering from what humans call post-traumatic stress disorder. This condition affects many human soldiers after combat. It causes flashbacks, nightmares, emotional numbness, and hypervigilance. That sounds like a serious mental illness, Commander Nexara said. How could someone in that condition be effective in combat? That was my question too, Veltar admitted. Dr. Min Kyung's answer changed my understanding of what it means to be human. The alien commander's voice became very quiet. She told me that Jinho's trauma came from his empathy, not from his fear. Every person he had killed in combat remained alive in his memory. He remembered their faces. He wondered about their families. He carried guilt for ending their lives, even though his actions had been necessary for survival. Veltar looked down at his hands. Dr. Min Kyung showed me Jinho's military record. In one battle, he had engaged enemy soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. He killed 3 men with his bare hands to protect wounded comrades. The official report called it heroic action. It does sound heroic, Officer Kreloth said. Jinho did not see it that way, Veltar replied. He told me about that battle in detail. He remembered the face of each man he killed. He knew that one of them had a picture of children in his pocket. He knew that another had been trying to surrender when Jinho struck the killing blow. Veltar's voice began to shake. Jinho saved the lives of 4 wounded soldiers that day, but he was haunted by taking the lives of 3 enemy soldiers. He understood that his actions were necessary. He knew that he had done the right thing, but he still carried the weight of those deaths. The room was completely silent. I could not understand how someone could be both proud of their actions and destroyed by them at the same time, Veltar continued. So I spent more time with Dr. Min Kyung, trying to learn about human psychology. Veltar stood up and walked to the wall where a large star chart showed coalition territory. She explained that humans have a unique relationship with violence. Most species either embrace it or reject it completely. Humans do both simultaneously. They are capable of terrible brutality when necessary, but they never stop feeling the moral cost of that brutality. How is that possible? Vashti asked. Dr. Min Kyung said it comes from human evolution, Veltar replied. Humans developed as social creatures who needed to cooperate to survive. But they also developed in a dangerous environment where violence was sometimes necessary. Their brains learned to balance empathy with aggression. Veltar traced his finger along the star chart, following the borders of human space. The result is a species that can kill efficiently while maintaining their compassion. They can make hard decisions while understanding the full moral weight of those decisions. They can be warriors while remaining fundamentally decent people. The alien commander turned back to face the room. But this balance comes at a cost. Human warriors carry emotional scars from every act of violence they commit. Even when that violence is justified, even when it saves innocent lives, it still damages something inside them. Veltar walked back to his chair but remained, standing behind it. I asked Dr. Min Kyung how humans could function as an effective military force while carrying this emotional burden. Her answer was the most disturbing thing I learned during my time on Earth. General Thakmore leaned forward with interest. What did she tell you? She said that the emotional burden is exactly what makes human warriors so effective, Veltar replied. Because they understand the cost of violence, they use it more carefully. Because they feel the weight of every death, they fight harder to minimize casualties. Because they never stop seeing enemies as people, they never become mindless killing machines. Veltar's mechanical arm began clicking softly again. She explained that the best human soldiers are often the ones who are most damaged by their experiences, not because trauma makes them better fighters, but because the kind of person who becomes traumatized by violence is also the kind of person who will use violence responsibly. The room was quiet except for the soft clicking sound. I began to understand that human military doctrine is built around this paradox, Veltar continued. They train soldiers to be effective killers while maintaining their empathy. They teach warriors to make hard decisions while understanding the moral consequences. They create protectors who are willing to sacrifice their own mental health to keep others safe. Veltar sat down heavily in his chair. Jinho exemplified this paradox. He was one of the most effective soldiers I had ever encountered, but he was also one of the most compassionate people I had ever met. He could eliminate enemy targets with surgical precision, then spend hours comforting wounded civilians. The commander looked around the room at the young officers. I watched Jin-Ho during a rescue operation in a contested zone. Enemy forces had taken civilian hostages. Jin-Ho infiltrated their position alone and eliminated 6 guards without raising an alarm. He rescued 12 hostages, including 3 children. Veltar's voice became strained. After the mission was complete, I found Jin-Ho crying in the transport ship, not from fear or relief, but from grief for the guards he had killed. He had done his job perfectly, but he was mourning for his enemies. How could he function as a soldier while feeling such grief? Captain Mordan asked. That is the question that changed everything for me, Veltar replied, because I realized that Jin-Ho's grief was not a weakness. It was the source of his strength. Veltar stood up once more, his movements showing the weight of memory. Jin-Ho fought so effectively because he understood exactly what he was protecting and exactly what he was destroying. Every mission mattered to him because every life mattered to him. He never became casual about violence because he never stopped feeling its cost. The alien commander walked to the center of the room. That is when I began to understand what human warfare really means. It is not just about tactics or technology or training. It is about people who are willing to carry the weight of necessary violence so that others do not have to. Veltar looked directly at each officer. Human warriors do not fight because they are warlike. They fight because they are the only ones willing to pay the emotional price for peace.